Okay, good morning. Welcome. It gives me great pleasure to welcome everyone to our first virtual Spotlight event as we turn our sights to focus on the Spotlight on Israel. My name is Sami Busaba, and I'm honored to be serving as the president of AmCham Dubai, and I welcome you on behalf of our AmCham Board of Directors. Today's program is in collaboration with our friends from AmCham Israel, AmCham Bahrain, AmCham Abu Dhabi, and the bilateral U.S. Arab Chamber in Houston, Texas. Providing programs across our extended network is just one of the ways that we provide value for our members. Thank you to each of the chambers and their members for joining us today. It is our intent that genuine connections are derived from your participation here. So please note, we will facilitate any introductions between participants following the event. Feel free to reach out to the AmCham Dubai team if you'd like to avail of the opportunity. Those assembled this morning represent the broad business community as we explore how those of us operating here in the region can leverage the Abraham Accords to create maximum impact for our businesses. It seems like a great foundation for an engaging discussion. Some of our members regionally situated are still unpacking the engagement strategies as the full impact of the Abraham Accords remains to be determined. Our goal today is to help all assembled here gain a deeper understanding of the playing field. For example, American business in the UAE, which incidentally is the US's largest trading partner regionally, may indeed wonder if this is an opportunity or if this actually is competition. We also question if Israel will be shifted into our region going forward. These are certainly valid questions, and we don't claim to have all the answers, but we do hope that the insights shared here today will help our stakeholders be prepared as proactively as possible for what the future holds. We think a great deal of potential exists in the fields of technology and cybersecurity, life sciences, education, and of course supply chain and logistics, among many others. One of our key deliverables to our membership is knowledge sharing, and we are certain that today's amazing speakers will enable us to deliver on this as they share insights from their respective areas. If you have questions throughout the event for the speakers today, please type them into the chat box and we will address them at the end of the session. One housekeeping note for this event is that the Chatham House rules apply, meaning quite simply that this discussion is not for attribution. This is typical of AmCham events and enables us to have candid conversations for the benefit of our stakeholders. At this time, I need to advise that Ms. Sausan Hassan from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Israel has been called into an urgent meeting and is unable to join us for this reason, as she had previously planned to be with us today. We do look forward to having the opportunity to hear from her soon. With that said, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome an old friend of the AmCham Dubai, Ms. Dale Carden. As a U.S. foreign policy professional with more than 15 years of experience serving in 7 United States embassies in the Middle East, South Asia, and Latin America, Dale has advised 7 U.S. ambassadors. Her extensive experience in diplomacy, commercial advocacy, public policy, foreign policy, government relations, military cooperation, intelligence, international negotiations, and bilateral, multilateral economic cooperation and agreements has been shared with our membership on previous occasions, and she is a professional who delivers what businesses need to know. Currently, Dale is the managing partner at Elliott Barrett Group, which is serving as the official consultant for the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the UAE. Dale is providing political and business advice to Israeli government institutions and business groups on the political and economic landscape of the UAE. She's also helping Israeli companies identify business opportunities and partnerships here in the UAE. Without further delay, please welcome Dale Carden. Dale, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us today.
Good morning, Sami. Good morning to the AmCham team and to the AmCham membership and all the others that have joined. Sami, you're very kind to say all those kind words. It's always good to be back with the AmCham team and the friendships that we have there. I've come to Sami and the team before as a US diplomat and spoken on topics about the GCC and other relevant issues that relate to the US relationship with the UAE. But this time, I'm actually here to talk about Israel's relationship with the UAE. So I find myself in a slightly different role than I have been in the past. So it is a little strange for me. So please bear with me. But with that in mind, my focus really wasn't so much to talk to you about the Israel-UAE relationship, because that I know is not the core of what this chamber and this membership is interested in. As Sammy mentioned, the big question that I get from not just American companies, not just American leadership, but from the French, the Brits, other European countries, is the same idea of what does this mean? What does this new relationship between the UAE and Israel mean for US businesses or European businesses? Is this bad news? Is this mean that now we're losing ground to another player, a player that is very exciting and interesting and new to the UAE partners? And therefore, maybe they will inch out competition that has been here forever. I would like to think of it a little bit differently. And I think Sammy touched on that a little bit. From the Israeli perspective, and I think from the UAE perspective, the US relationship and the role that US businesses can play can be a quite positive one. And I think it could be an opportunity for US businesses. And I'll come to that in a minute. But before I get there, maybe we can just go back a little bit about where we stand with the Abraham Accords and how it's gone since August. I've been involved with it both from when I was a US diplomat working on the issue, and then since then, since August, I've been actively involved as a consultant, trying to help the Israelis understand the landscape, which is, as you can imagine, not having had a relationship with the UAE officially, not having any relationships in the GCC officially for the length of their history. This area is extremely new and different, and the cultural, especially the business and political culture of the region was very new to the Israelis. So they were very keen to learn more about how to engage the Emiratis and how to move this relationship forward. The one thing that has come out of it from the very beginning, and what was become very obvious from the very beginning, is that there was a great deal of excitement on both sides. And I think, in fact, the excitement levels were so high and the expectations were so high that from the beginning, my concern was that there was a need to manage that expectation, because there was an expectation that all of these discussions is going to lead to tremendous amount of business opportunity and immediately without any hiccups. And we would move forward into this, opportunity and in levels of opportunity that would just come very suddenly. And after a few months of tough negotiations and back and forth, both at the government level and at the business level, things are leveling out, right? As can be expected, the excitement is still there. The level of excitement remains very high, but it's become slightly more realistic and it's more pragmatic and more practical in nature. So now we are at a phase where the conversations have gone beyond the rhetorical and the big ideas, and now down to what can we do practically with each other. And I'm sure you've seen all of the news about the government-to-government relationship, where I've been involved quite a bit. The government-to-government relationship is moving forward. Some of that discussion obviously is about policy. How can the two countries cooperate on the political landscape? How can they cooperate militarily? You understand, there's been all the news about the F-35 deal, and so on. So there's been a lot of sort of political level discussions about how that relationship moves forward militarily, politically, and strategically. But the bigger piece of the conversation, and I think the more diverse piece of the conversation, has been how can the two countries move forward in the business landscape. And I think the key here is there's the level of interest isn't just about what can the Israelis bring to the UAE, or what can the UAE bring to Israel. It's this idea about how can the Israelis and the Emiratis collaborate to become a force for good and a force for technological change, not just in the region, but across the world. So I think that's the crux of the business relationship, understanding that neither the Israeli market, not the UAE, nor the UAE market are significant in terms of size. The collaboration is really most useful in creating business opportunities that can reach beyond the UAE. So in that regard, the opportunities, the key areas of opportunity, I think Sammy touched on some of them, the key sectors that I am most involved in, that I get a lot of questions about, and there's a lot of excitement on the Israeli side and also on the Emirati side, are the obvious ones. Some of them that Sammy mentioned already. I'll just run through some of them. Food security. It seems to be at the top of at least one of the top priority issues that the Emiratis seem to be most interested in. And that area where they're really focused on is technologies related to food production. So, in that, and that's also related to some of the water management issues and agriculture that minimizes the use of water, that minimizes the use of soil, whatever that might be. There's a lot of interest in trying to collaborate, not just to purchase things that are made in Israel, or having UAE investment funds invest in Israeli agricultural technologies in Israel, but the conversations really ought to be and are moving towards collaborating and doing some production here in the UAE, where the technologies can be put to good use. Financial technologies is another area where there's a great deal of interest and a great deal of momentum moving forward. Healthcare, and I wanted to mention the healthcare aspect a little bit more, because I think there are some of these that I think is very, very useful for U.S. businesses to be aware of, and there's some that you probably are aware of already and working on already. But in the healthcare sector, there is a great deal of interest in Israeli healthcare technologies that can be used in the UAE, whether that is through partnerships with American companies. For example, I give you an example of the conversations that are ongoing between an Israeli healthcare technologies firm, a small to medium-sized technology firm that is in conversations with Cleveland Clinic, a US partner, to try to bring that technology using Cleveland Clinic as a platform to provide that service within the UAE. So there are lots of conversations in the healthcare sector as well that are ongoing. I've already mentioned water management, energy, providing energy solutions. And that's the key here, is that the Israeli companies that are coming forward aren't the big, they're big companies that can do the full spectrum of technologies within the energy sector, whether that is energy management, whether that is electricity production, whatever it might be, energy storage. It's really small scale technologies that can actually be piggybacked onto US companies, technologies, bigger US platforms. So I think that's really where some of that collaboration might be most useful in the energy sector. Where we are already seeing a lot of that collaboration is in the defense sector. Israeli small defense companies that have small technologies in the defense sector that are extremely attractive to the UAE market have already collaborated and continue to collaborate with US partners, the bigger defense firms, so that they can work, it's a symbiotic relationship where they can work with each other to provide a better service to the Emirati client. So I think what we're seeing in the defense and security sector is something that can be replicated in all the other sectors that are of keen interest in this relationship. Cyber and AI is another, as you can imagine, another area where there's a lot of interest, a lot of people coming forward. The Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs wanted me to particularly mention that education and innovation, specifically in the AI sector, is something that they're very, very interested in, keen on promoting, and would love partnerships with American companies and American incubators and American innovation centers that can bring together ideas here in the UAE that can be used in the UAE for as part of the sort of the industrial sector development process that the Emiratis have undertaken. So with these sectors in mind, what I really believe the opportunity for US companies is Israeli companies, first of all, are very new to the market. They really have very little understanding of how the UAE functions, how UAE businesses function, how the cultural aspects play into how the businesses work together. So what Americans can bring to the table, and any collaboration between an Israeli and American company can bring to the table, is American experience in this sector. We've been here for a very long time. American companies have been doing this here in this region and in this country for decades. And that experience is invaluable to a new player like the Israelis. And the long-term relationship that Israelis and Americans have had, and a relationship they understand very well, and a trust that exists already, can then again be put to good use in trying to introduce Israeli companies into this market. And what is also attractive to the Israelis is American brand recognition, or American companies that have been here for a long time, and having that trust relationship with the Emiratis allows the Israelis a certain amount of entree if they have an American partner to bring them forward. And what's in it for the American company? I think it's an opportunity for American companies to bring Israeli technologies into their mix, so that they are providing a better service to the Emirati client. So, we have to look at this as an opportunity. I mean, there are areas where clearly there's competition, and the Israeli companies are coming in and competing directly against small and medium-sized US and European technology companies. And that's, of course, going to happen. But I think the larger relationship is going to be in the collaboration, and there's tremendous amounts of opportunities there. The other thing that they can learn from us is the chambers. I think the Israelis that are coming together, whether that's in delegations or from a particular sector or from various regions of Israel, if they're coming here, they're having a hard time, and I'm dealing with many of them. Hard time sort of understanding the landscape and understanding how chambers and groups and industry groups relate and connect with Israeli partners. So there's an area where I think the chambers can be helpful to each other, not just in sort of the American chamber or the business councils providing advice to Israelis, but also being able to understand through that interaction what the Israeli companies are really most interested in. And it's beneficial to, I think, both the chambers and the chamber membership to understand what the Israelis are bringing to the table, and how we can help them identify the right opportunities and where there might be an opportunity to collaborate. So with that in mind, I would also just mention that, since the beginning of the year, last year, at the end of the last year, and I think GITEX was probably the time where there was the largest amount of Israeli companies in country. And at that time, it looked like Israeli companies were just going to keep coming, and there's going to be delegations after delegations, and there's going to be all this engagement. But starting in November, because of the coronavirus, there has been a stoppage in travel between the two countries. And we saw almost an immediate halt come the new year. And since then, much of the collaboration has been over Zoom and over these kinds of online platforms. And that has really further hindered the ability to make progress on the understanding piece of things, right? I mean, it's different to come to the UAE and see what's going on here versus engaging with Emirati businesses via an online platform. It looks like that that time frame may be changing soon. So we are anticipating that starting the post-Ramadan period before the summer, there might be an influx of visits and delegations and in-person interactions, both UAE delegations heading to Israel and Israeli delegations coming here. I see that as an opportunity and as a time where there can be an opportunity to engage with US companies as well, and maybe look for opportunities where there can be collaboration and find a way forward. So the May to July timeframe, to me, is critically important in trying to advance the relationship further and trying to find trilateral opportunities on how we can strengthen this relationship. I have already talked to the American Chamber about possibly looking at options of how we can bring delegations and perhaps engage with your membership, and we can look for more opportunities in that regard. With regard to the relationship, I think also, the Bahrain piece is also obviously critically important. The excitement on both sides, whether that is on the Bahraini side or on the Emirati side, is very high. On the Israeli side, the awareness of the opportunities in the UAE is significantly higher than the awareness of opportunities in Bahrain. Dubai is well recognized. Everybody wants to come here. So businesses that are in Israel are interested in the GCC market first only look to the UAE, and so we're having a hard time sort of lumping in Bahraini and Emirati interest together. There's a lot of sort of side interest in Bahrain, but core interest in the UAE. But ultimately, there are opportunities in both places that the Israeli companies would like to take advantage of. So we're going to look forward towards how this relationship, the UAE-Israeli company relationship, can be broadened into a regional presence and a regional experience. So far, it is sort of focused on the UAE specifically or on Bahrain specifically, but ultimately this has to move forward into these other countries that they have new relationships with, whether that's Morocco, whether that is Sudan, and so on. And the Sudan and Morocco issue, while the UAE and Bahrain relationship has moved forward and there's been a lot more progress, the Morocco and Sudan relationship is still sort of nascent and moving at a much slower pace. And so ultimately, the goal would be to have that relationship, whether that's the UAE-Israel relationship or the UAE or the Israeli-Bahraini relationship. Ultimately, the relationship has to be comprehensive and regional and has to have a regional scope. So a lot of Israeli companies, despite the fact that there aren't relationships with the other countries in the GCC, are keenly interested to also understand what the opportunities might be way down in the future in Qatar or in Oman or in Kuwait or even in Saudi Arabia. So while there is a clear understanding that there is no momentum or movement towards moving that relationship forward at this time, companies that come here obviously want to understand the landscape. They want to understand not just what's happening in the UAE or what the UAE means for the region. They also want to understand how the regional dynamics affect what they're doing here in the UAE. So even in that regard, the regional experience that is the American companies have, most of you that are working here in the UAE inevitably have broad-reaching relationships throughout the region, which is also something that could be incredibly beneficial in trying to understand how the Israelis can leverage this UAE relationship and the Emiratis can leverage that Israeli relationship for regional collaboration. So these are the kind of core areas that I believe U.S. companies and U.S. companies can take advantage of opportunities with the Israelis. The French, the Brits, and others have also, have had longstanding relationships with the Emiratis and with the Israelis, and there has been some interest on their sides as well, in trying to find some areas of collaboration. In healthcare and in agriculture, the Europeans tend to be very forward-leaning in bringing their technologies, and there has been engagements with those kinds of companies here in the UAE and in Israel. But I believe that U.S. companies can play a bigger role and can take on a bigger piece of this collaboration. The challenge for a lot of companies that I have run into is that the regional offices that are here in the UAE, they cover the MENA region, or they cover the Gulf, or they cover MEA region, including Africa, but somehow Israel is not included within the regional structure of US companies, making it very difficult for US companies that are based here to engage on this topic because they believe that that belongs to some other regional office, and that's outside the scope of what they're interested in. And many of them have offices in Israel who are engaging perhaps directly with the Israelis on what's going on in Israel, and the regional office that's here is engaging with the Emiratis on what's going on here. But it doesn't seem like there's a natural way for the three-party relationship to come together. The good example of that is in the U.S. military side. Up until very recently, the U.S. military CENTCOM, Central Command of the U.S. military, did not include Israel within its purview, and recently that was changed to include Israel within CENTCOM, and that inclusion has really led to a completely different outlook on how the U.S. engages within the region. And already discussions are not just in the military side, but even on the political and diplomatic side, discussions are ongoing about the trilateral relationship. How do we leverage that trilateral relationship to strengthen the Abraham Accords? And I think that is, while it is extremely important in the strategic and military and the political side of things, I think it's even more important in the business sense. And while government is not the one to take the lead in that trilateral relationship, I think U.S. businesses, Israeli businesses, and also Emirati businesses can take that to the next level and take it to the same level of trilateral cooperation that we're seeing on the political and on the diplomatic and on the military side. I think this is a model for the future. I do not believe that this is unique to just, this Abraham Accords in this one time frame. I think this is a model for the future, using partners that might bring a separate, different, smaller skill set that can be leveraged with the American larger presence for regional collaboration. That's the wave of the future. And I think we're seeing that definitely in the political side of things. We're seeing that in the strategic sense, and we'll definitely see that in the business sense as well. That's my sort of core interest in what I'm doing currently with the Israeli government and with Israeli businesses. My focus always, and every piece of advice I've given to Israeli companies has been to say, try to find a way to collaborate with a larger partner that can actually make your position stronger. And I think that if Israelis are just coming to service the UAE market, then the size of an Israeli company might be sufficient. But if you're looking at how the UAE and Israel can collaborate for regional, for the regional market, or for the Africa market, or for for the global market, then more the merrier. And I think the strength of the American companies can only make that even more possible. So with that, I think those were kind of the core things of what I wanted to talk about, and I'm willing to take this in any direction specific that anyone is interested in, but I didn't want to drone on and on, through various sectors and topics if that's not of interest. But so I'd rather that, Sammy, you and your team, and maybe the questions can lead the discussion in the directions that your membership would like to take it.
Wow,
Dale,
thank you so much. Sorry, Sammy.
Yeah.
There
ahead,
are some
Tara.
questions already in the box. So if Sammy, you want to have a look at those and then address them to Dale, that would be great.
Yeah, we can do that. Let's address the immediate questions to Dale, and then we'll have a separate discussion with the panelists and then have another round of questions. So Dale, a couple of things came up during the chat. First, let me just say thank you for your excellent insights. I think this definitely gives us a good perspective of the multifaceted opportunities. Your background, your knowledge, your working knowledge of this conversation is obviously extremely valuable. So we're very glad to have you here with us. A few things that I came out of it, that I think is very interesting. Number one, you called out water and energy. And I think our next speaker and his panel is very relevant because, as you'll hear shortly, Oded is very involved in the water and energy business. So we're going to get to that in a second. But before we do that, one question that came up is, One of the key anchor markets, as we all know in the GCC, of course, is Saudi Arabia. We talked Bahrain, you talked about the UAE being a regional hub and the American companies here using the UAE as a platform for the region, but what can you say specifically about Saudi and any insights in that regard with the impact of the Abraham Accords?
I think, the relationship in last year, speaking strictly from a diplomatic and political perspective, last year when the Abraham Accord discussions were ongoing, there was some excitement that there might be some level of, momentum towards an Israeli-Saudi diplomatic ties. And that hasn't come to fruition. And while there is clearly ongoing discussions, and even we can see in the press that there has been discussions on both sides, and there has been questions asked of the Saudi leadership about the potential for an Israeli relationship. While it looked early on, it looked like, mid last year, it looked like there was an inching forward, at least in the press of, at least the idea wasn't completely taboo. Up until I would say about a year ago, just the idea of talking about a Saudi-Israeli relationship was completely taboo. You couldn't even ask someone in the Saudi leadership whether that was possible. And I think starting last year, and I think, we have to congratulate the UAE on the step they took, because it really, the leadership of UAE in taking that step really allowed countries in this region and the press in this region to start asking about what more can countries do, and can we move forward in these with these other countries. So what UAE did, and here's where I would put on a little bit of my political diplomatic hat back on, and I think that's the core of what I think everybody's so excited about what the UAE has done, is that step that they took not only allowed the countries like Bahrain and Morocco and others to step forward and say, yes, we can also normalize relationships, but it allowed others, the community in general, the media in general, to be able to start asking the question, can we go to Saudi Arabia? Can this happen in Saudi? So while that has been a step in the right direction and there's been progress in that sense, we're not really seeing a great deal of momentum on the political side. Can it happen? Will it happen? Maybe down the line. How many years will it take? I'm not going to be the one to speculate, but it's not around the corner. If I were to bet on it, I wouldn't put it on being in the very near term. But there is a great deal of interest in it. What this does, however, the UAE-Israel collaboration does, is that production in the UAE, that collaboration and production within the UAE allows for a certain access to the Saudi market. And I think that's what everyone's really excited about. And I think they are going to try to take advantage, as one should, try to take advantage of that relationship for regional reach, right? So if you're going to produce something, if you're talking about the UAE, and I think UAE leadership has talked about it, they aren't just talking about food security for their own sake. They're talking about food security to the point of being able to become a net exporter, at least within the region. And if that's the case, if there is technological developments here that can be then, that collaboration, if that can be then exported into Saudi Arabia, I think that's an incredible opportunity. And I think that opportunity definitely exists. So even if Israeli access to the Saudi market remains closed for the foreseeable future, the collaborative approach does allow for a certain level of access. And I think everyone's keenly interested in that. So the difference then is, are we gonna then see the service sector getting involved in Saudi Arabia? No, that becomes much harder. What can happen is a more of a trading relationship that can exist, products that are created elsewhere that can make it their way into the Saudi market, and so on. But it still leaves the services sector and the information technology type services still off the table. And I think that's a real loss, right? I mean, that's an area where the Israelis definitely bring a great deal of strength, but they're unable to tap into that because there is no relationship there yet. But the more we see relationship in the trade realm progress, it's a matter, I mean, it's natural that it's only a matter of time before we will see something more.
Yeah, thank you, Dale. That's excellent insight. And as a follow-up to that, and going off the back of what you said about making Israel part of our region, right? So most American companies here today don't put Israel in their regional scope. There'll be MENA, MIA, MISA, or whatever it might be. So as we look at that change, and as you said, CENTCOM already did that with the U.S. military, the follow-up question that we have on the chat box is the Arab boycott law remains in many countries potentially an impediment to move from a dialogue to commercial engagement, right? So do you see that as a risk to full normalization?
Within the region, you mean?
Yeah, so other countries within this region still have the Arab boycott law in place, with Israel. So is that an impediment to kind of normalizing?
I think moving Israel into a regional framework within your businesses that includes Israel within the region shouldn't run by its very nature against the anti-boycott laws that some of these countries have in place. What it also offers, like in the case of CENTCOM, what it offers is another opportunity to have some of these conversations with these countries if it comes up, if it runs against this. That is the strength of chambers like this, right? I mean, big American business groups and big American business can push the ball forward, sort of like CENTCOM, right? I mean, you can sort of take that stand and say, hey, this isn't about going against laws you have in place in your country. This is about what makes sense for the company within the region. And if that means we need to have a conversation about how these laws are applied, then we can have that. But at least it moves the ball forward. In my opinion, it's at least a way to have a conversation about how these relationships can progress. And I have to say about the anti-boycott laws, most countries have those laws in place, but the implementation of the laws are varied and the attitudes towards those laws are changing. We cannot assume that what was written in the law, as an American lawyer, we always talk about the intent of the drafters. And I think the intent of the drafters of some of those laws have evolved over time. And I think that we have some room. I think there's sort of a little bit of a swinging door here that I think businesses can take advantage of and at least push certain conversations with regulators that could be advantageous, not just to the US company, but for regional collaboration.
Any step is better than no step at all, right? I guess that's
right.
Sentiment. Yeah, absolutely. One other question that came up, and this is an interesting one as well, and this came from Qais, who's the president of AmCham Bahrain, is what differentiates the Egypt or Jordan Accord from the Bahrain or let's say the UAE one? Other than for security, the Egypt and Jordan agreements have not been as beneficial for their countries, in his opinion. How can this change?
So I think there's a key difference in the Egypt-Jordan relationship with Israel, which was really designed around security and Israel's security. And there was a bit of a tit for tat, right? That the Americans were going to give something to both parties in exchange for allowing a certain relationship with Israel, which came in the form of aid, and it also came in the form of the QIZ setups in both Jordan and Israel and in Egypt, which Jordan, the QIZ setup would allowed in Egypt, for example, to, there were certain zones within Egypt, and they continue to exist. There's like 20-something zones within Egypt where collaborative production between the Egyptians and the Israelis would have tax-free access into the United States. That was an incentive that was offered to the Egyptians to allow for more collaboration between the Israelis and the Egyptians. But it really was, a transactional relationship, right? It wasn't really like in Egypt, Israel. We know that the two countries didn't sort of say, hey, we believe there is some real economic benefit to this relationship. What really happened at that time and continues to happen is that they really just focused on the transactional nature of what that relationship offers, right? Whether that is aid or defense relationship, or whether that is tax-free access into the United States. So progress really stopped when it came to any kind of momentum outside the QIZ, right? So there really wasn't any reason for the Egyptians or the Israelis to think outside the QIZ framework. And the QIZ framework wasn't just like, a regional, it wasn't like just about location. It was also about certain kinds of things that you can, for example, textile exports into the United States. So it really just stopped in those sectors. Right. So the collaboration just stopped because that's where the transactional benefits were to the Egyptians. And so it stopped there. And attitudes really didn't change as a result of that because it remained very contained. And I think Jordan, to a great extent, is another great example of that. The Jordanians did away with the QIZ because, they have a free trade agreement with the United States now. But the relationship really just kind of became stagnant, around this concept. The difference really is the UAE-Israel relationship. It's really about UAE and Israel. It isn't about the United States. It really is about UAE and Israel recognizing the value of the partnership, understanding the importance both strategically, politically, and economically of that relationship. And the Abraham Accords, the American involvement in it, was just to really kind of, icing on the cake, right? But the leadership on both sides had to believe that this was good for them. This is very different from what I believe happened in Egypt and continues to happen in Egypt and Jordan, right? That was really kind of Americans being more actively involved in offering them transactional benefits in exchange for that relationship, which is what has really kind of made it more stagnant. The UAE-Israel relationship, except for the fact that there was some discussion about the F-35 and some of these like defense related gives on the American side, the bulk of the agreement is really directly UAE and Israel, because both sides, the leadership believes in it, and they really believe that there's strategic, political, and economic benefits in it. That's the difference. And I think not just that the leadership believes it, it's also that the people believe it. I think that people, that's what I was talking about, at the top of the discussion, I was talking about managing expectations. In fact, I thought that belief had gone too far. Like, people had gotten too excited about what the benefits might be, that there would be no hurdles and it would just be all like, it was in a honeymoon phase, right? Like the relationship was just all love and it was all good until you come home from the honeymoon and then you figure out you don't like the way he brushes his teeth, that kind of situation has evolved now where it's become more reasonable and more, manageable, I would say more pragmatic and more practical. And I think that's the core difference. The Bahrain, UAE, Israel relationship is significantly different from the Egyptian and the Jordanians because the momentum of the relationship is coming from the leaders of these countries and from the country itself, not something that is being pushed forward by the Americans.
Very, very valid perspective, and I can't help but laugh at your analogy of the honeymoon. I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it. Hopefully, I think, that in itself is a very promising outlook because of that leadership that's there, and I think that's a very different element to what happened, with the Egypt and Jordan thing. So it's I think a very optimistic view. So thank you for that. You mentioned Bahrain. I think, you talked about Bahrain earlier in your conversation as well. A couple of questions around Bahrain. So we'll start with, how important do you feel it is that we carve out a separate market segmentation for Bahrain as opposed to considering Bahrain kind of as a secondary goal for opportunities? So how do we get Bahrain, just as high on that priority list? And then as a follow-on to that, in your opinion, what sectors can attract Israelis to collaborate in Bahrain, in the Bahrain market? So those two questions are pretty much related, and we'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think, is it realistic to expect that an Israeli company that is going to come to the UAE, to the GCC, in their mind, okay, we're coming to the GCC, we have relationships with UAE and Bahrain. If I'm coming to the UAE, if I'm going to think about it from the GCC, from Israel, my immediate thought will be Dubai, because that's what I've heard, that's what I've seen, that's what's in the news, and I think the Dubai, and then I say, oh, well, Dubai is in the UAE, and then okay, UAE, and so that's kind of how the initial conversations go, right? Bahrain is in the initial stages always going to be, oh, and there is Bahrain. But the interest is always going to be in the UAE. But I think that's a missed opportunity, because Bahrain offers a certain advantage that the UAE doesn't. For example, Bahrain might be, given the size of their economy and their need to attract more business, there might be more incentives that the Bahrainis might be willing to offer to attract Israeli businesses there. The Bahrainis are also keenly interested in developing their industrial sector. And so it's keenly important that Israeli businesses look at what market works best for your production. If you're going to come and you're going to collaborate, let's say, FedEx is thinking about collaborating with an Israeli technology company for a new sort of tracking system or something that they're going to roll out. And they're looking at Bahrain or UAE as a place to set up that assembly or production. You got to look at which market, because distance is not really is not a factor. So you don't have to worry about like, hey, is it farther from UAE to get it out into the market, or is it farther? Because, it's pretty close in area. So you really have to look at who offers better incentives and who offers a cheaper option and who offers a really good option for you to do that. And in a lot of instances, the answer might be Bahrain, because it is playing against having to compete with Dubai. So they have to, compete with the UAE, so they have to make themselves more attractive. And in many areas, obviously, the UAE is just going to be more expensive just because of the cost of living in this country, and the cost of entry and so on and so forth. So there might be an opportunity. So often when businesses come to me, they're coming to me only asking about the UAE, but I'm the one who has to tell them, hey, but don't forget to take a look at Bahrain, not just for the sake of the Bahraini market, but because of what they offer as a regional production location or a regional collaboration location. So that's really, really important. The other thing to keep in mind, and this goes back to the question of Saudi Arabia, if you're really looking at the Saudi market, and if that's a place that you really are looking for down the line, whether that's a year down the line or 5 years down the line, Bahrain is a gateway into Saudi Arabia. The location's amazing for that. The Saudi interaction with the Bahrainis is quite deep and extensive. So it's really easier to have that conversation in Bahrain than it is to have here. So there are multiple reasons as to why in certain cases, Bahrain is a better fit than the UAE is. So it isn't so much about like, hey, I'll only consider Bahrain if UAE doesn't work out for me. Oftentimes you might want to consider Bahrain because it offers certain advantages that might be cost related or Saudi related that you should consider before you settle on the UAE.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, as you were talking, Faith from Bahrain has said that Bahrain is an active Jewish trading and finance community, which needs to be enhanced. So with that question, do you see kind of certain sectors like finance coming out ahead for Bahrain, or are there other sectors maybe that you would call out? And we had a question coming off, but go ahead first.
Yeah, on that, I think finance is one where, the Jewish relationship with Bahrain is well known. There's a Jewish community in Bahrain that has existed for a long time. Jewish significant business interests. Local Jewish families in Bahrain have significant business interests, and that is obviously an easy entry point. for any Israeli company that is looking to get in there. But that might also be a missed opportunity, right? Because if you are going to just specifically target just the Jewish community, you're missing out on the excitement that the normal Bahrainis, the Arabs, the Muslim population of Bahrain has in this topic, right? So, because this isn't really a religious topic, this is about country to country relationship. And in fact, lots of Bahraini companies that I know, Bahraini families, are keenly interested in attracting Israeli business to Bahrain. So while the Jewish community is a great way to sort of have an initial conversation, you can't miss the fact that there's lots of others that are also very, very interested in it. I think finance that you said is a good place. That's a service sector that can actually have some access into the Saudi market. That might be a reason to get there. But I think what Bahrainis are keenly interested in is in the industrial sector because it's cheap to produce things there. There is a local production system. So they're really interested in attracting that. Really interested in agricultural technologies and turning that into some kind of regional production network that can leverage the Saudis as well, right? Because the Saudi agricultural production system is a very large one, and the Bahraini agricultural sector could play a peripheral and supportive role to that, and actually use that Saudi big presence as a platform and a way to get your technology into the marketplace. So I think there are some sectors that work better for those reasons in Bahrain than they do in Saudi Arabia. I mean, of course, you can always, if there's a specific company or a specific sector that somebody's interested in, I'm happy to take a look at that and actually give them an assessment of what makes more sense.
Thanks, Dale. That's excellent, and we appreciate that insight. There was a question that came in as you were talking, and I'd rather maybe answer that question with our panelists because it's about the Israeli startup community. So I'm going to pause that question from Nawaf. And Kate, thank you for your additional comment on the Jewish community in Bahrain have built lots of goodwill among others around them. So it's not religious, but a historic business relationship. We definitely want to keep that in mind. The last thing I'll say, and Dale, we really appreciate your thoughts, your perspective, your insight today. I also want to say thank you for calling out the role of the chambers. We have quite a few chambers of commerce that have joined together to create this event. And I do want to, just reiterate the fact that you can always rely on those chambers in Bahrain, in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, in Houston even, as resource, as go-to people to help answer more of these questions, along with, of course, Dale's expertise. So thank you, Dale, for your kind of call out to the chambers as well. We appreciate that.
On that topic, Sammy, if I could say one more thing that just came to me. One of the areas, obviously, that come up whenever there's a new relationship is, the regulatory and policy type questions that come up, right? Or regulatory policy challenges that the countries or the companies from those specific countries run into. So if there is a policy issue, that has been something that the chambers have been actively involved in. This new relationship could be another leverage point that your chambers can use to say, hey, the Israelis are also going to have a problem with what you're doing with this particular topic, right? Or this regulatory hurdle is also causing problems for these new Israeli startups or new Israeli companies that are coming. So there's a strength in numbers, and the excitement that the Israelis have generated from the UAE leadership is going to make that a more viable and more attractive point that you can use when you are advancing the interest of US companies. Because ultimately, any policy regulatory work you're doing is not just benefiting US companies, it's benefiting the business community at large. And that's what, I think that's the strength of what you provide. And I think you can do that leveraging what the Israelis are going through now, because they're coming to the problem set for the first time. So they are like having a big reaction to it, which you can kind of now, because Americans have gotten used to it, right? The Israelis having a bigger reaction to some of these hurdles that now you can say, hey, look at the reaction they're having, and you're having, this is going to cause a problem. And I think that's another place where I think it's a win-win, right? I think it's a win-win to be able to collaborate and have that message go across as a collective.
Absolutely, that's a really good point. And we have certain committees, right, that all our chambers probably work on, and our goal is to have a solid, central voice for business to government, right, to advocate. So to your point, if we include the Israeli business voice in those advocacy programs, we're only going to get stronger, and we'll get our message across even more powerfully. So yeah, we definitely will take that advice and include and be more inclusive of the Israeli business voice as they see opportunity and issues come up, right? So thank you for that, Dale, and thank you again for joining us today. We're going to shift gears now that we know more about the perspective and the opportunities. I think we're going to shift gears to translate to what it's like on the ground in Israel. And we have a panel of experts that have been assembled to give us those answers. The leader of that panel is going to be Mr. Oded Rose. Mr. Oded is the CEO of the Israel American Chamber of Commerce, and he has been since April 2016. The chamber aims to increase trade, investments, and strengthen economic relations between the U.S. and Israel. Previously, Oded served as the CEO of Flow Industries since 2008, an Israeli startup in the water and energy markets, and this goes back to Dale's comments on the water and energy being such an important sector. Prior to that, he was serving as the Vice President of Marketing and Sales at AmCham, and a leader in industrial and municipal water disinfection equipment. Oded earned a Master's of Science in Medical Research from Tel Aviv University School of Medicine, an MBA from Wharton School of Business, University of Pennsylvania, and an MA International Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. On another note, as you can tell, education is important to Oded, and I must say, if you get the opportunity to ask him about his passion project, you must. He is the founder of EMIS, Eastern Mediterranean International School, which is a school a school for change that brings together students from Israel, Palestine, and the rest of the world into a 2-year study program promoting peace and intercultural understanding. Simply an amazing initiative. Oded, we're here to hear from you. We'd love you to share your insights from each of your panelists, and the floor is yours now, Mr. Oded. So thank you for joining us, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Mr. Busaba. Many thanks to AmCham Dubai, with your leadership, to Kara Nazari, Executive Director, the Chamber's Board, and Helena for this opportunity. We're very excited about the opportunities that were opened with the Abraham Accords and the relations we've since built the regional AmCham network in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, and hopefully soon with others. We already have good relations with our friends in Jordan, and hope to increase this network and open business opportunities for our members and for the members around the region. Thank you, Ms. Dale Carden, for your excellent remarks on the geopolitical situation now. Indeed, very enlightening. A few words about AmCham Israel. It was founded in 1965, and it is the largest binational business organization in Israel. We have about 250 member companies that together account for about 30% of Israel's GDP. Our board consists of 30 CEOs of our members, and it is chaired by Mr. Yaniv Gardi, who is the CEO of Intel Israel. Intel Israel is the largest non-government employer in Israel, with close to 14,000 employees and a very large chip production facility here. About half our members are American companies and about half are Israeli, with a few European and Asian companies with US operations. You have heard about the Israeli market a little bit and the ecosystem in the previous session. What we wanted was to provide you with perspective from leaders of US companies operating in Israel, to perhaps give you some first-hand experience and tips on how it is to do business here. With me on the panel are 3 distinguished business leaders. All 3 are members of our board of directors, and all three either head or participate in one of our chamber's committees and forums that were just mentioned before. I will introduce the panel members and then ask the one common question to all three. And after a round, I will ask more specific questions to each as much as time will permit. You're welcome to ask questions in a chat, and should we have time, we will address your questions to the most appropriate panel member. Our panelists are Mr. Yochai Gafni, who is the CEO of Dow Israel. And he is also the chair of the AmCham Circular Economy Forum. And I will ask him later to say a few words about that. Ms. Ronit Ben-Basat-Rom, she is the head of People and Places for Intuit Israel, a fintech, one of the largest fintech companies, American companies in the world. And last but not least, Dr. Daniel Katz, who is the general manager of Bristol Myers Squibb in Israel, and he's also the chair of the AmCham Israel Pharma Committee. So please welcome them. And the first question is the same to all three panelists, is can you please describe the history of your company in Israel? What were the key challenges at the beginning and what are they today? What are the key advantages in the Israeli market for your company as an American company and when compared to some other international markets? And I will ask Mr. Yochai Gafni to start with this question. Yochai.
Sure. Thank you, Oded, and thank you everyone for giving us this opportunity to share some of our experience with you here today. And I must say on a personal note that it is a real privilege, I think, for all of us to live in this day and age that we can have these conversations. And we very much look forward to partner with all of you in further strengthening the business relationship. So again, thank you for that. So a little bit about Dow in Israel. So for those of you who are not familiar with Dow, very quickly, we're a material science company, about $45 billion in annual sales. I think we're the second largest material science company in the world. We're headquartered in Midland, Michigan, about a 130-year-old company, and we've been operating in Israel for the past several decades through several agents and distributors. About 4 or 5 years ago, we have seen that our sales in Israel are not moving exactly in the same rate as the GDP. So GDP is growing very rapidly in Israel, especially in the last few years. I'm sure all of you are familiar with that. And we've seen that the correlation with our sales is not exactly where it should be. And we've also seen that that the local innovation ecosystem that everyone keeps talking about is very vibrant, but we're not really kind of enjoying that party. So we have made a decision to open a local office in Israel, and this has turned out to be a very good decision for Dow and I think also for Israel, for the ecosystem. So we've basically made that decision for 3 major reasons. The first one is to really support the local infrastructure that we already had in growing sales. And by the way, we've been very successful at that ever since. We've basically doubled our sales just in the last 3-4 years. We can't get into specific numbers, but selling today in triple digits of millions of dollars. And then to connect with some technological company to develop solutions together. And then the third is to connect with the innovation ecosystem, startups, and so on and so forth. This has been a very interesting journey for us, Oded. In terms of the challenges, they were quite obvious from the get-go, and they have evolved, as you mentioned. The first one is definitely the policy and the bureaucracy. It is not super easy to start with to do business in Israel. Once you get into a rhythm and you understand all the policy and the bureaucracies and you have local people and so on and so forth, things run much smoother, but the beginning is not straightforward. And the most important thing, if you would ask me what is the most important thing, is to have local boots on the ground. Period. Without that, it is super challenging to do business in Israel and to connect with the local innovation ecosystem. The second challenge is actually not so much related to Israel. It's more about American corporates. And I know that that's what we're here to talk about today. Israel is an interesting place for American corporates. I don't know how you feel in your corporates, but it's in the Middle East, but it's sometimes part of the Middle East. It's sometimes part of Europe. American corporates eager to do business, but not sure exactly how to play that. So it's kind of, it's an interesting place. And what I would say is that creating that internal visibility and credibility within your organization is absolutely crucial, and it's not easy in the beginning. And then the third thing I would say, which is some of the challenges we faced in the first 2 or 3 years, but now we're facing less of, is just the market acceptance to American ways of doing business. Israel is very vibrant, active, fast-paced area. American corporates, at least chemical, conservative chemical companies headquartered in Midland, Michigan, 130-year-old, are not exactly that, to put it bluntly. And it takes a while for the ecosystem also to know how to work in a pace of an American corporate like ourselves. So it has been a journey, and I think we're doing much better. In terms of the strength, just last point I'll mention, very, very obvious, and there's a reason why we've grown so much in the last few years. It is a very fast-paced moving region, for sure, probably one of the fastest. It is something that people maybe don't talk a lot about, but it is super collaborative. We, as an American company, can have certain strategic conversations in Tel Aviv that we cannot have with an American company back in the mainland, even if they're headquartered in Michigan as well. There's just this sense of camaraderie that opens doors, which is a very clear strength for the economy in Israel, and I think it's a point that is very important. Actually, there is also a very low risk aversion, so people are willing to kind of roll up their sleeves and try it out, and it is something. And if you combine these things with the technology savviness of the companies and the individuals in the country, that makes Israel an ideal place for pilot, for trying things out in a very fast pace, and then scale it to the big world. So again, a fascinating journey for us, and we'll discuss more in the coming, I guess, few minutes.
Thank you very much, Yochai. And Ronit, can you please address the same? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much for for the opportunity to be here. This is amazing for all of us, I think, and everybody feels so fortunate to be and to live in that time that we can actually do business together, and wishing to come to visit you ASAP. So telling a little bit about our company, I'm actually heading the people and places in Israel and some areas of California for Intuit company, which you might know. Intuit was established by Scott Cook in 1983, when he actually saw his wife sitting and writing too many checks to all the providers and to all the entities in the US. And he decided that there must be a very, very smart way to actually do that. And he created a new, very innovative product of the QuickBooks, if you know that, TurboTax, and many other ways to do better businesses in the US and to actually initiate the tax to the tax authorities. So at the moment we have over 50 million customers in 180 countries, and we opened the branch in Israel in 2014. The reason we opened that is very, very similar to other companies. We actually acquired companies. And Israel is a very, very, as Yochai mentioned before, Israel is a very, very talented country when we have a lot of innovation, a lot of creativity, and it's very, very easy for companies and major companies like American companies to actually try by actually acquiring companies. So at Intuit, we acquired 2 companies. We started we acquired a Czech company at 2014, and in 2015 we acquired a security company which is called Portshift. And then we decided in 2016 that the talent in Israel is very, very serious, and we want to invest on the talent and to build technology and R&D through Israel. This is, by the way, and Oded, I don't know if you want me to open that and actually show a slide, but this is actually the way that a lot of American companies are growing in Israel. If you can look on the map, and I don't know if we have time for that, and Oded, just guide me if you want me to share a slide.
Yes, sure. If Helena can allow that, please.
Helena, would that be okay if we share
a
few
sure.
slides?
I'll give you
I'll give you the ability to share just 2 minutes there.
Okay, so what you can see on the slide, and that's why we thought that maybe that could be interesting for you to see that, is I'm just sharing the slide of the companies that were acquired. And if you look on the map, you can actually see that although we have so many active, 8,000 companies active in Israel, we do have a lot of acquisitions that happen in Israel. So if you look on the company, you can see on the right side how many acquisitions were done in Israel and when did they establish the site. So you can see that actually from 1972, we had the IBM and we had Intel in 1974 that actually started to run the acquisitions for Israel. And a lot of the companies, when they started, American ones, will start with either acquiring a small team or do acquire of the talent. And talent is one of the major issues or the major thing that we can actually offer in Israel. We can offer the creativity, the innovation. We're not afraid to try, and even if to fail sometime. And we do create, and we have a lot of talent that we actually develop through the universities. And we develop that through the military system that actually create a lot of innovations for the security and a lot of AI and machine learning companies. And we have a lot of very good universities that we actually do that. So just in a glint, if you want to see, just to look on the fintech, you can see how many companies do we create or do we have in Israel that actually enjoy that talent. And then you can see that by American companies, European companies. On the bottom of that, you can see all the ASEAN and other companies that are actually in Israel. So this is just in a glance.
Thank you so much, Ronit. Dani, we turn to you and to talk about the pharma industry and Bristol Myers Squibb in Israel.
Okay. First of all, I of course join the excitement of the two other panelists talking, for this audience. It was, 2-3 years ago, it was like a dream. And this dream come true, and I think we all hope that it will broaden and include other countries and even stronger relations. So I will talk a bit about Bristol Myers Squibb in general and in Israel, but I would say it's parallel. It's a reflection of the other multinational pharma companies, Americans and also Europeans. Bristol Myers Squibb is a $40 billion company focused on the severe diseases, mainly oncology and hemato-oncology. We are the pioneer in immunotherapy. We have 2 molecules on the market, and immunotherapy is of course the leading field in oncology, covering more and more tumors. In Israel, we established a subsidiary about 10 years ago. Before this, products were sold by a local distributor. This is a natural road of pharmaceutical companies. They start with a distributor. When the business grows, then they open the local office, and this gives usually a boost to the activity in the market. Now, as an American company, maybe it's a bit easier in Israel. First of all, of course, the US regulations, the FDA, they are fully acceptable and appreciated in Israel. So if you come as an American company, you're being trusted, you are audited, you have a high level of quality controls and assurance, and the FDA registrations of drugs are accepted in Israel. Israel is a secondary regulatory authority that reapproves the FDA approval. Also, the attitude for the US in Israel is very, very positive. Of course, the US is perceived, as our best friend and collaborator. So in this sense, this is a helpful to be an American company. I want to touch a point that I think one of the previous panelists touched, that it's important to have Israelis leading the company in Israel because, and again, we're a mixture of East and West. On one hand, we're very Western and technology-wise, but on the other hand, there are many, many cultural issues between the lines, Israeli language, which is different. So I think that the companies really prefer someone who has to lead the company, who has the international, the enterprise mindset, but also have the Israeli touch. If you know how to talk with the health authorities and the reimbursement committee and understand your KOLs between the lines, this is very important. And out of 20 multinational companies in Pharma Israel, which is the organization that gathers all the international ethical companies, only there was zero GMs which are not Israelis. Now there are 2 GMs out of 20 who are not original Israelis. In Israel, what we do as BMS Israel, and again, it's a reflection of other pharma companies. We do, of course, marketing and sales, and the market is very institutional. If you are reimbursed, you have, all the market is available for you. Would like to indicate that the reimbursement system in Israel is one of the most generous in the world. Almost everything, almost every new molecule which with a significant benefit to the patient is reimbursed in Israel. We have all our 10 immunotherapy indications and tumors fully reimbursed with zero co-payment of patients. This is incredible. I think it's similar a bit to UAE, but there are not many other countries. We have better reimbursement for majority of European countries. And also from the US, where there is a quick reimbursement, but only if you have private insurance. So what do? We do marketing and sales. We do clinical studies, and most of companies are doing a lot of studies beyond the per capita ratio. And we also do a lot of business development. And we talked, I saw a question about Israeli startups. Israel is the startup nation, and I think we all know that we have the highest number of startups, at least in the biomedical field per capita, same as publications. And we have a lot of business development activities. BMS is collaborating with a few Israeli startups and VCs. We are the 3rd country in the world after US and Japan with the numbers of business development collaborations. This is definitely something that Israel has beyond its size. So our sales, and again, most company sales are very high per capita, but again, we are a small country, and I can tell you modestly that the Israeli sales are not really moving the needle of the BMS turnover, but we may bring the next blockbuster from Israel, and this definitely will move the needle. So I think this is, that's on a nutshell, Oded, for your question.
Okay, thank you so much, Dami. Thank you for all 3 panelists for the first question. I turn to Ms. Ronit. Ronit, as the head of people and places in Intuit, you also have a very a leading role in the industry as far as human resources. Can you there are about 300 or over 300 American companies in Israel that have R&D centers here. Intuit itself, I think, employs over 200 people. A lot of them are R&D, research and development engineers. And can you speak about the advantages and challenges? We all know that there are over 20,000 open positions right now in the Israeli industry for engineers and for technical positions. Can you talk about the advantages more? You mentioned a little bit, but can you talk more about those advantages and challenges that you see as an American, as a technology company here in Israel? Thank you.
Sure, yeah. So first of all, I think that we have a lot of opportunity to actually help and develop and grow our talent in Israel. The positive side is that the talent in Israel is counted as one of the most innovative one in the world. So if you look to actually develop new company and you want to have a lot of innovation and creativity, and to have people that are thinking out of the box, Israel is definitely the place to go to. I think that this is a combination of the risks that people are taking in younger times, like joining the army at the age of 18. We actually assess all the population in Israel at the age of 16 to see the talent in the talent and actually to develop them. And the system we developed in very, very early ages is actually to find the talent in the person and to develop them very, very quickly. So I think, the positive sides why to come to Israel, and that's why many of the companies would come to Israel, would be the creativity, the innovation, and number one will be the talent of the employees, that you can get things that you not necessarily you can get in other countries. The reason for that is that people are open to risk. And this is a plus and minus as well. So people are very happy to go to startups. If you look on the resume of a lot of the younger population, you would see that many of them tried at least 1 or 2 startups. Not necessarily, they need to succeed. And this is something that you need to understand about Israel. We are very, very good on trying, but it's not a word of, if you fail in Israel, like if your first startup is not a success, it's not a big deal. It's okay, it can happen. And compared to other cultures that you might take it with you on your resume and says, okay, I failed really badly. People here are actually growing from that. And if you see serious investors, and if you look on what they are looking for, sometimes when we find, like when we created company as a teammate, and I was actually part of the management team that created that, this is a cybersecurity venture capital, we looked for people that failed. And we thought that after they failed for the first time, the next startup is much better than the first one. And it's not bad to actually take them after they did 1 or 2 startups and then start again. So the good part is that innovation, creativity, not afraid to try is the great ones. The challenges, however, is that we're not very disciplined on anything. Like if you need us to actually agree on everything, you might find us difficult. We might be arguing too much. And this is the culture of the Middle East. I think that in some areas, we are very open-minded. We like to say, and maybe even to start a sentence saying no, but, which is not that American way to start a sentence and saying that you agree on something. And that could be even when you agree. So people are coming very direct sometimes. And the good part is that you always know where you're standing. And it's not a bad word to actually ask Israeli, what do you think? A lot of managers that actually use that learn how to manage better. And they're saying that if they have Israeli on their team, they know first that they will tell the truth. He will tell them exactly what he thinks. And maybe he'll bring him another angle, which you would never think about it by himself. So I think you have the opportunities, you have the good sides, and you have the challenges. The main challenge that we see at the moment is that there are so many companies and a competition to the talent is very, very high. So companies are willing to pay a lot of money to good talent, and people are willing to check the market and even to move much quicker than they did before. So 2 to 3 years in a company is a good time to be. And if you want to increase that, you actually have to motivate them and to build new areas. One thing that keeps us awake on the HR, except from the COVID and the change in the hybrid world, is the skills for the future. And we all know that a lot of the skills that we need for the future are not even learned in the universities today. And we actually, if we build new areas of biomed or all kind of new areas that we'd never had them before, we need to train the employees from the beginning. And we have to make sure that our employees will be trained. So a lot of the things that we're working on is how to train them on the job, how to make sure that the training will be very accurate or very open-minded, that will bring them to know how to operate a lot of different areas and to allow them to grow at the same company and without actually going again and again to university to learn from that. So that's something that we keep our minds on, the skills of the future and about the hybrid world, which will bring us, by the way, a lot of opportunities to employ people which are very talented in another areas which are more remote than we used to have. It's not necessarily just the hub of the office. Now we're open-minded to actually have much more talented people from other locations as well. Hope that answered the question.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, Ronnie. Danny, I turn to you. You also serve as BMS's scouting manager for new technologies, and that kind of relates to what we've been discussing. What makes, in your opinion, the Israeli technology ecosystem so unique for BMS, and what is BMS looking for in Israel? And can you speak about your experience in integrating Israeli technology into large US companies?
Yes, I started my role as the general manager of BMS Israel 6 years ago. I have a background, like most Israelis, in entrepreneurship. I established myself a few startup companies. So this was, in my DNA, as many Israelis. And this was like an extra of my role. I started to try to match between the Israeli companies, Israeli startups, and business development at headquarters. At the beginning, it didn't really work well. The company is very US-centric. They have the Boston hub and the Bay Area. And I mean, what can they find in the Middle East? But, as being, as Ronit said, being, a bit pushy, a bit Israeli, I succeeded to expose them to some initiatives. And they saw some interesting stuff, because Israelis' initiatives are really out of the box. If I compare them to German initiative, the German will have, 5 startups. It's the same molecule, but a different angle. Israel will go crazy, go from here. So they were intrigued, and then a delegation of business development came to Israel, to Biomed, and then we established more official relationships. It took like between a year and 2 years, and then I became the only ex-US official scouter of technologies in Israel. And again, the Israeli technologies are out of the box. They are different, they are very creative. And again, as Ronit said, we are not always very organized. Not everything that we say is 100%. Sometimes it's not 100% checked or double checked. We run very quickly, but again, the pharma companies are used to it. They will recheck it themselves, but they like the creativity. And then I went to the US for a couple of months. The company really liked the model, so I duplicated it to 20 other countries. So we have someone in BMS Germany, BMS France, Italy, Korea, who is doing the same thing as I'm doing, looking for technology. And I actually manage all these operations. So I can see the Israeli startups and technology and the other markets, and trying not to be arrogant, but I can tell you that Israel flow is as big as all the other 19 countries. That's because we are very active, but it's also there is unbelievable innovation here. I can tell you, sometimes I look for a competitive technology to something I've seen. I look, the patents and databases, and then I find the competitor 2 blocks away from me in Herzliya Pituach. Huge innovation. Why is it? It's hard to tell. It's many reasons, but one of them, I think, is I would say, multidisciplinary collaboration. If in Israel he had an idea, he wants to, start a startup. Let's say he's a physician. He has a friend from the army who is an engineer. He will call him. He has another friend of his wife who is IT software. Will call him, and in 2 weeks they'll have a company. And this doesn't happen in other places. So I think this is one is the very open communication. It's the very innovative, out of the box thinking. And you know, I'm seeing what's happening here during the Corona period. That the Corona period is classic for Israeli entrepreneurs. You need to find quickly, out of the box solution, low cost, and maybe you can ease regulations because you can go fast. And you see Israeli startups, businesses are blooming in the Corona. Again, I'm talking about the biomedical field. They are blooming. Digital health is going crazy. This is exactly the environment for Israel. You know, pressure, out of the box solution, quickly, and maybe not so difficult regulation. You know, you can maybe skip a few steps. And again, this is what the company is looking for, but of course, in a very conservative way. To most of the opportunities, they will say, no, let's recheck it. Let's put it into, you know, the governance of a heavy conservative pharmaceutical company. But again, just, I mean, maybe the message that, again, from someone seeing opportunities and technologies for many markets, what's happening in Israel is different. It's not just a cliche, it's different.
Thank you, Danny, for your perspective on this. And I'm going to turn to a different area. Yochai, I'm back to you. Dow is a global leader in circular economy. You initiated 2 years ago AmCham Circular Economy Forum. Can you speak to the forum activities and what is Dow hoping to achieve through this activity?
Sure, thank you, Oded. And I'll keep it brief because I see that there's some very good questions coming up and I want to make sure that we have enough time to cover those. Okay, so indeed, as you mentioned, a couple of years ago, we initiated the Circular Economy Forum or initiative in the American Chamber of Commerce. And we did that for several reasons. First, I think most, if not all of us, agree that this is a very important topic, but we wanted to raise the awareness for the for this topic specifically, the importance of it, and to make sure that it's front and center for the entire Israeli innovation ecosystem. And that was a very powerful way of doing that. The second reason was to create collaborations across between different companies, between different segments, between different parts of the value chain. We have members, and I'll speak about the forum in a minute here, but we have members from government agencies, education, large companies, startups, different types of members, because we are confident that this is a very big and important problem that no company can solve by itself, and no certain segment in the industry, by the way, can solve by itself. And this collaboration is absolutely crucial. So this is another important part in terms of what we're trying to achieve in this forum. And then the third thing is to really bring the best of both worlds. And what we mean by that, you know, we talked here a lot in the last, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes about the Israeli ingenuity, innovation, ecosystem, out of the box thinking, you know, fast pace, you've heard it. And then you combine that with big world problems that American corporations bring to the table. And we wanted to see if this mix can actually create real significant value, where we bring some of the technology and innovation into big world problems, and where we can bring some of big world problems into the innovation part to try and help some of the problems, some of the issues that that exist. So we're seeing this actually as a win-win situation, and that's really what's coming together here in the last few months. In terms of what we're doing in this forum, so we have, and Oded, correct me if I'm wrong, 50, usually there are 50 something people participate in the discussions. Okay, I don't remember the exact numbers. Significant large corporations like Intel and Unilever and Procter & Gamble and PepsiCo and Toyota and so on and so forth. I'll go through the list. I won't go through the entire list, and startups and academia and government agencies. We talked about that, and we have 4 tracks. The first one is that we've put together an education plan, a training program to train students and employees of these companies and other stakeholders in terms of circular economy design work. So it's a several-month program that we've put together. The second track is what we call a regulatory track. how can we take some of the challenges that exist in Israel, best practice from the world, and work together to try and find solutions and advance the Israeli ecosystems in terms of the regulatory activity and environment that exists in Israel, because we are behind, quite honestly, from a regulatory standpoint in Israel, excuse me, compared to Europe and also the US to a certain extent, I would say. And then we have two tracks that are more related to innovation. The first one is around plastic, and it seems like going into a certain direction around packaging specifically. How can we work together along the value chain to address specific challenges related to plastic reuse and circular economy in that space? And then the fourth one is around open innovation, where each company brings several key challenges that they have. We've opened a certain platform online for open innovation for the Israeli ecosystem, for people to come in and propose their solutions, and certain proof of concepts will come out of that, and so on and so forth. So 4 tracks that are ongoing at the moment, making very good progress, and we're seeing some very interesting concepts coming out of that.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Yochai. I have 2 last questions, and we'll make it short so we can answer some of the questions from the audience. Danny, back to you. I'd like you to speak briefly about the committee that you are heading, the Pharma Committee at AmCham. What makes it unique, and can you describe a little bit the operation and how we work with the Ministry of Health in this regard?
Yeah. The Pharma Committee in AmCham Israel is combined. It's very heterogeneous. It combines of pharma companies like Bristol Myers Squibb, Americans and even Europeans, but it also have Israeli companies, Israeli importers, Israeli developers, startup companies, distributors. So it's a variety of companies who are, it's also medical devices. So we are covering a wide range of companies and organizations within the pharma, biotech, life sciences, I would say, industry. One of our main purpose is actually to leverage our strengths together, including AmCham, and Oded is very active personally, in order to reduce regulatory barriers and create stable and positive ecosystem to operate. And that's what we do. We have close relations with authorities, whether it's the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Economy, Reimbursement Committee, other stakeholders. And again, this is in an Israeli way. So, each one of us has his own personal contacts, bring it to the table. And, we have a startup company that, one of the founders is also the head of a big IRB, a big clinical trials committee, approving clinical trials in hospitals. So he's connected to one side. So we leverage in a very structured way, but not too much bureaucracy. All our abilities, connections, and needs. There are sometimes it's the same need of a startup and a pharma company. Sometimes it's different interests, but we find, we find needs and gaps which are relevant for most of the participants, and we work in front of governmental and other stakeholders who can help us in this main goal of, assisting us from an ecosystem perspective to do business, that it will be stabilized. And of course, we also, leverage our AmCham connections, with the US organization, with US various organizations that assist us. And again, this relates to something I said at the beginning. If you come with United States, on your back, you are stronger, and there is a very good collaborations from various stakeholders. And we are trying really to achieve very specific goals, like, shortening the time to approve clinical studies, stability of prices of drugs, transparency in registration process, and stuff like this.
Thank you, Danny. Ronit, last question. You're a key member of our U.S.-Israel Business Summit Committee. Can you please tell our audience about this, and why is it a good opportunity to visit Israel in our coming summit that we plan to have at the end of the year?
Of course. As you know, as Dad knows very well, I'm very, very active on building that panel and actually working with him on the summit. And my thought is that this is for us the first opportunity actually to do things together. And I feel that we definitely have a win-win in here, and we can actually learn from each other. And I saw some of the questions about acquiring companies or talent in another locations. And I say definitely we can do that. And we can do that if we build right relationship among us. And if whenever we do events, your teams will come to visit us, will come to visit in your events, and we'll create a lot of shared organization that is working together. And I think as we spoke before many years ago when we were trying to do the peace during the discussions with the US Chamber, if you recall, I don't know how many of you have been a part of that, but I was there as the prior CEO of the Chamber. And when we did that, we talked about the opportunity to do business of 30 to 40% in the region. And I think as much as we want to do the business, we need to actually grow the relationship. And if you come to our summit, you'll definitely gain the opportunity to meet the most important people in Israel to do business with, and the best population for you to actually work with and to get to know in Israel. As you know, we're talking about ourselves in Israel, that instead of 6 degrees separation, we're actually 1 or 2 degrees separation. Everybody knows everybody, and if they don't, they probably have a neighbor or know somebody that knows the other person. So once you know the people in Israel, you definitely gain a lot of knowledge to the market, and you'll have opportunity to see if you want to invest in the market, to do businesses together, and to do another activities. I encourage Oded and the team to actually do the same whenever you have events. If we can actually invite our people to your events as well, you'll gain twice. It's not necessarily just once a year that we'll meet, we can actually meet much more. And definitely with the Corona and the COVID situation at the moment, it might be harder. So that's great that we started all the Zooms and all the meetings that we do at the moment. But I think that there is nothing like a personal touch. So we invite you to come to our event, and we definitely want to see you, and we'll help you to actually do business in Israel. And we look forward to actually visit you and maybe join on the Expo to Dubai or other events that you might think that it's even worse for our people to travel. And people will take the flight, will definitely come to visit and definitely come to the locations. Everybody is so curious to do the business together, and everybody is so cheerful from this relationship. So thank you for the opportunity to be here again today.
Thank you, Ronit. And you're planning possibly to be in Dubai in May, I hear.
Yeah, I might be in May, and the Women Summit, there is a big delegation that is actually going for women, international women that are coming to do business in Dubai, and I'm planning to be there, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I want to thank our panelists, and to turn this back to you, Sami, is it? If you want to leave questions to our panelists or to anyone else. Thank you again for this opportunity, Sami, and we look forward to doing a lot of business together. But just I want to say, you can see us, any of the participants, either through the chamber, your local chamber, or any way you want. Contact us. We're here to serve you and help you in any way we can here in the Israeli market.
Thank you, Oded. Thank you to our panelists. We really very much appreciate you sharing your insights. I think there's a lot of synergy that came out of this discussion, a lot of opportunity for sure, and some great ideas. Just the most recent one, Ronit, we love the idea of having joint events and sharing more events with each other as chambers and as the business community. I think that's something we can take on very quickly and start putting into place. So on that note, also, we look forward to welcoming you here in Dubai and anyone of the other panelists that are visiting or the members. If you are coming to Dubai, you do have, your extended chamber family here to welcome you. So we're definitely looking forward to that. Just to touch on some of the questions, I'd like to go backwards a little bit. We had a question earlier on from Nawaf, and the question is, does Israel have a group for the startup community? Who is the leader and who are the key players in the startup industry in Israel? And I think, Ronit, you talked about the 1 or 2 degrees of separation. So maybe you can shed some light on who do we go to talk about startups?
Firstly, to the chamber, to the Israel-America chamber. That's very, very easy to actually answer that. I think that we're the hub that actually gather all the people. And if you need any help, this will be the first place that I would recommend everybody to go to, honestly.
That's one, and we can connect to anyone with the Innovation Authority, which is a government agency that energizes this whole startup community through some government funding. With specific startups, it's easy for us to find. We have a lot of contacts through our members and through other organizations we work with.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We'll take that on and make sure we may take advantage of those opportunities. There's a couple of questions that are a bit related, so I'm going to just maybe I'll ask you, Oded, and you can ask whoever you would like on the panel to answer. But does the panel see these initial business overtures of Bahrain and UAE as part of an eventual stepping stone to the GCC? Or does the panel see the current Israeli business strategy just to target the UAE and Bahrain market opportunities? The secondary question to that is, with the peace accords, there are further opportunities for Israel to expand R&D and innovation into regional countries that can benefit from youth and resources available in these countries. So would you see this happening, or are Israeli industries still suspicious of venturing into new markets, especially in neighboring countries? So a bit of parallel questions, Oded.
Okay, so maybe I'll take it later, but ask maybe Yochai if you would like to say a few words about that, and then we can elaborate.
Sure. Well, I would say, inshallah. I mean, I think that in general, companies in Israel would definitely want to strengthen the relationship with the entire GCC region. At the same time, I'll also say shwaya. I mean, we'll take it one step at a time. We need to get a lot of quick wins fast to build that credibility, build the relationship, and grow from there. What I would say is a sentiment, and again, I would try to generalize a little bit. Israeli companies and American companies with local headquarters in Israel will not only be kind of neutral to strengthening relationship and venture into neighboring countries, they would be super positive and super interested in doing so. I would say in general that Israelis are thrilled about the relationship that are coming here together in the last few months. Will seek very actively and find any opportunity to strengthen that further and to expand into new region and bring people from the GCC, from Bahrain and Dubai specifically, into Israel, hire here and there, and so on and so forth. So I would encourage everyone on this call here that think that there might be such opportunities to reach out. And I think that you will find on the Israeli side, not just kind of an open ear, but a very eager, positive, interested, excited counterpart to work with.
Perhaps I would like to add to what Yochai just said, that we also get very good collaborations from the regional US embassies. So the US embassy here in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, and the one in Amman, and the relations they have in Ramallah, they're always trying to encourage this kind of activity between Israeli and American companies and local companies So already a lot of quite a few of our members, the American and Israeli companies that employ local teams in Palestine, for example. There's a long list, Microsoft, Intel, IBM, and then more and more and more, that have local teams, Palestinian employees, either directly or through outsourcing companies in Ramallah, in Nablus, even in Gaza, that work as an integral part of the development teams. We have a relationship with AmCham Jordan in Amman, and again there we are starting to build some kind of a similar program where we can introduce Israeli and American companies to local outsourcing companies, and through that perhaps expand the relationship. Again, there are political sensitivities. We are very, very well aware of them. Sometimes it's walking in between the drops, as they say, the raindrops. You need to walk in between the drops. But there's definitely, like Yochai said, excitement, willingness here, willingness by the corporates to look into that, and definitely we would, shwaya, but we'd like to perhaps follow that path and make relations. Again, we can do it through the chambers with you, and introduce companies from here to companies in the UAE and Bahrain and other places.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Oded and Yochai, for the insight. One last question that has come through, and this goes back a little bit to that kind of, the mergers and acquisitions that were discussed earlier on the panel discussion, is do you envision acquiring local talent or even local companies in the Bahrain and UAE markets?
Danny, perhaps you'd like to address that, and then maybe others.
Yeah, well, again, from a BMS perspective, it's not relevant. The BMS has a subsidiary in Dubai, with, by the way, covering all the Arab countries. From technology companies, startup companies, those companies usually do not buy companies, they collaborate. And I think there is a lot of room of collaboration between startup companies and companies or hospitals or medical infrastructure or investors in the Emirates. And I know things are already happening. And those are collaborations that can lead both to, I would say, usage or better sites in the Emirates, but also, of course, global innovation. And this is happening, and I think this is maybe something that AmCham can somehow promote, as some of the speakers have said, in creating the scene, the stage for discussions, for collaborations. For example, a roadshow of Israeli startups, let's say in the biomedical field, together with relevant stakeholders, investors, hospitals, whatever in the Emirates. I think this can work. I think collaborations again are happening and can happen very quickly, even without shwaya, because Israelis are very open, for this. And it's not like acquiring companies in billions of dollars. It's starting maybe a bit smaller and happen very fast.
Oni, do you want to add anything on that from your perspective?
Sure. I think that this is, as we said before, this is building relationship. And building relationships start from university relationship and working together and getting to know each other. So I totally agree that there is a lot of potential. I don't think anybody will buy a company because it's located somewhere. They are buying a company just because of the talent, about the people, the talent, and the product itself, and the innovation. And innovation can happen either together, can happen separately, and definitely as much as we'll get to know each other, I would assume that it will start with investments, which I will see as mutual sides. Like I wouldn't be surprised if investment will come from your side to ours. I wouldn't be surprised to see the vice versa. And I think that as Danny mentioned, and as Yochai said, shwaya shwaya, I think this is about learning the relationship and building the relationship and getting to understand who knows what is the best. And then trying to work it out together. So I don't think it will happen tomorrow morning, but I'm definitely positive about that. As much as we will do more trades together, work together, get to know people, and even study together. I'm really curious to see, like, if my kids in the future might learn in Dubai or in other places, whether people from Dubai will come to learn in Tel Aviv, or Bahrain will come to learn in Tel Aviv University. And I see the talent, and I think that what Oded created actually is just the pioneer to things that we will see more in the country, of changing the talent, learning from each other, growing that, and then seeing more acquisitions and more like talent sharing from all ways of either investment, acquiring, or any other ways.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Sorry, Oded, did you have
No, just to build on what Ronit said about building the talent and your kind remarks about the school I founded about 7 years ago. So just to say a few words about it, because I think we would love to have students from the UAE, from Bahrain, come and study. It's the last 2 years of high school. It's a boarding school that brings students on scholarship, on partial scholarship or full scholarship sometimes, from 50 different countries for a 2-year international baccalaureate program. We have close to 200 students, 50 countries, 20% are Israeli and 20% are non-Israeli Arab nationals, many Palestinians from the West Bank, from Gaza. We've had Yemenite students, Saudi student, we had Iraqi student even, and from other countries. And we'd love to have from the Emirates. And more importantly, I'm very interested to open a similar school in the UAE. So if we can work on that together, that would be amazing. We'd love to have a similar school in the UAE, bringing Israelis to the UAE, bringing people from all over the world, living together and growing to be leaders of peace. So I hope we can talk about that further later on.
That would be wonderful, Oded. And as a matter of fact, many of our member companies on the AmCham are in the education space, so we can certainly facilitate some discussions. But very optimistic outlook, and it's really an amazing achievement what you've done with the school there. So thank you for your leadership. I believe we don't have any other questions that have come through, and I think we will buy some people back some time on their agendas, which I think no one will say no to. But I just wanted to say one last time a very big thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Oded. Thank you to Dale. Thank you to the AmCham Abu Dhabi, AmCham Dubai, of course, AmCham Bahrain, the Arab, sorry, I want to mess up the name, 1 second, because I want to say the bilateral U.S. Arab Chamber in Houston, and to Oded's organization as well. Thank you all very much for being part of this session today. I personally learned a great deal. I think we have a lot to talk about after this session. I think there's a lot of things that have popped up, some shui, some not so shui. A lot we can do together. We really look forward to the opportunities ahead and hopefully more of these engagements and events in the future. With that said, thank you all again for being with us, and to all the AmChams. I think I did mention AmCham Abu Dhabi, but again, thank you to all the AmChams for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. That will conclude our event today. Thank you.